and welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new here. I'm Andrea.M. and this is Real Crime Down Under. And it is so nice to be back after the little bit of a break for Bianca's wedding. She actually got married last Tuesday. It's a fabulous wedding, beautiful day. And now it's just time to get back to reality and get back to filming for you guys again, which I'm so excited about. As I mentioned before in one of my other videos, I am now going to be branching out to the Asia Pacific Rim. I'm also going to be branching out to the UK, the US and Canada and other sites globally for the real crime stories, also strange phenomena, missing people, 411s and disasters worldwide. I stuck to Australia for my first 12 months on YouTube because that was my safe place, but now I'm getting really interested in strange phenomena, disappearances and crimes that are committed further afield. So we are going international now. So if you would like to suggest a case to me that you'd love to see me cover, it might be one that I've never heard of or one that you've recently heard of and you haven't seen anybody else do before, or it might just be a favourite case that you'd like to see presented by me, please drop it in the comment section below and I will get that done for you. So a few updates. I have some major changes coming with the Paranormal group. It's going to be very exciting. It's going to be very different. And that's all I'm going to tell you for now. So if you want to see what's going to happen with that, you need to keep watching. And also I'm going to see if I can get a few things filmed over Halloween weekend. I have a few things up my sleeve that I would love to go and do. So if I get to go do them, I will see if I can film, because I think that's just going to be really fun for you guys. And we also have a few episodes of Halloween Horror Nights left. Unfortunately, not many people sent in their stories, but I have been finding plenty of stories from our local area and the internet, so they will be included. I have had a few things suggested to me by family and friends in the US, so that's really cool. So there will be another episode of Halloween Horror Nights coming up for you this week. And now I'm back to my regular filming schedule again, and it feels amazing. I missed you guys so much. I missed filming, but for an emotional thing like a wedding, it kind of just, you need like a week just to decompress after that, because it was just such a big lead up and the day went off absolutely beautifully. So yeah, and I've had a lot of problems with my sinuses again. You guys know that I have a lot of problem with that. The weather here in Australia is absolutely horrid at the moment. I'm missing winter, actually. Even though I was sick all winter, I miss winter because we're already into over 100-degree heat here in Australia. There's been bushfires. It's extremely dry. We haven't had rain for a long time, and that just, I'm so itchy. Pretty much all the time. So my sinuses have been horrid, and I just sort of needed a few days to try and get them under control. As you can probably hear, they're not quite under control. I apologise for that, but I really just wanted to get back and be with you guys again and bring you content and talk to you and start filming again, because I missed it so much over the last few weeks. So we're back to our regular scheduled programming, and I'm so happy about it. And to start off with today for Real Crime Down Under, I have got one heck of a case, and I do need to give a trigger warning for this case. It contains a lot of distressing content. Let me just say that, because the man that I am profiling for you today is one considered just lately, actually, from the programs and podcasts I listen to about this man. He is considered, now we have to take into account, we've had Ivan Milat, we've had Vince Dempsey, we've had Paul Denya, all really bad serial killers. They're now considering this man to probably have been our worst. What they uncover later on, because the forensics are only evolving and getting better as time goes by, is that he was known as the Granny Killer. He killed 6 elderly women over a period of time between 1989 and 1990. What they have found recently is Glover actually did these killings at the age of 58, which is very unusual for a serial killer. They don't usually begin their career as a serial killer so late in life. They usually begin at late teens, early 20s, and if they don't get caught, they just keep going, as we saw with Vincent Dempsey. The thing is with Glover is they've now uncovered that he may have been responsible for murders, assaults and other crimes in his 20s. And this will be covered here in the video today. So, I usually say like grab a drink, grab a snack. I would definitely grab a drink for this case. Whatever you're drinking, be it coffee or some other beverage. Because it's a lot and it's quite distressing. So, if you're triggered by these kinds of things, because it does involve elderly ladies, grandmothers, by this man. And I find it a very distressing case myself, but I think it's one that needs to be heard. So that's why I'm presenting it. But it is a hard case to present because around that time, I was in my late teens and my grandmother honestly was my entire world. And to hear about these other people's grandmothers, this monster. And he wasn't around anywhere near I live, but it still it freaked me out a bit. And I could just imagine what it would be like if, God forbid, somebody had done that to my grandmother. So it sort of brings a lot back for me, hearing about that case. But I still think it's one that people need to know about. So, without further ado, actually, just let me say, I can't remember if I said it before or not because I'm overexcited to be back, but if you're new here or if you've come back a few times and you're not yet subscribed, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing. I'm still trying to get to my 1,000 subscribers so that I can join the partnership program and start making a little bit of an income here on YouTube. It also gives other perks like channel memberships, sponsored commercials, I can rock the merch. I can have a merch store and, bring other things to you guys. So if you could please help me out and like, subscribe, share and comment, that would be great. So without further ado, now let's get into today's case. And just remember, it has a lot of distressing content, so please be advised. Today on Real Crime Down Under, we are looking at the granny killer, John Wayne Glover. John Wayne Glover was born on the 26th of November 1932. He was an English-Australian serial killer convicted of the murders of 6 elderly women aged from 60 to 93 over a period of 14 months from 1989 to 1990. His victims included Winifreda Lady Ashton, the widow of the English-Australian Impressionist painter Sir William Ashton. And this happened in the suburbs located in Sydney's North Shore. The fact that the victims were all elderly women led to Glover attaining the nickname by the press of the Granny Killer. Following his arrest in 1990, he admitted to the murders and was sentenced to consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So, as we've just said, Glover was originally from England and he was from a working class family in Wolverhampton. Glover was convicted of many petty crimes dating back to 1947, and they were things like stealing clothing and handbags. He left school at the age of 14. He served in the British Army but was rejected when these crimes were discovered. He emigrated to Australia in either 1956 or 1957 with no qualifications. And when he was first here, he was living in Melbourne. Shortly after emigrating from England to Australia, Glover was convicted of 2 counts of larceny in Victoria and a stealing charge in New South Wales. In 1962, he was convicted on 2 counts of assaulting women in Melbourne, 2 counts of indecent assault, 1 of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and another 4 counts of larceny. And he was sentenced to a 3-year good behaviour bond for this. And this is where I start wondering why. And this always happens with these guys. They start off with these kind of misdemeanory type things and they work their way up. So he's already assaulting people. He's already indecently assaulting people. Why was he not put in prison then? A good behaviour bond? I don't understand, because he's not going to reform. He's only going to get worse. And this seems to happen a lot, especially with our justice system here in Australia. I think it's a little better now. But these historical crimes that I present, it's almost like they're aiding and abetting the criminals, because they're not dealing with them in the manner that just in my opinion, I think they should have been dealt with. Maybe if he'd have had a stint in jail then, it might have, woken him up to the fact that, yeah, if you're going to do this, you're going to get caught, you're going to go to prison. But I think with some of these killers and other criminals, a 3-year good behaviour bond, to their mind, would be saying, I got away with this, so I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do more. And that's what always seems to happen. It's like they have these guys, they let them go, chaos ensues. That's just my opinion, so please don't come for me. But after covering a lot of these cases for over a year, they all seem to have a very similar thread. So Glover had a troubled relationship with older women in his life. And this would include his own mother, Frida, who had several husbands and many boyfriends as Glover was growing up. And it said he had a problem with her promiscuity. Then, in 1968, his mother-in-law. He also had a problem with him when he married Gay Rolls, his wife, and they moved into his in-laws' house in Mossman in Sydney. Glover's mother then also moved to Australia in 1967, and she died of breast cancer in 1989. Later that year, Glover was also diagnosed with male breast cancer. Glover separated from his wife, who took their daughters to New Zealand. And this was before John Glover began his killings in the late 1980s. Before John Glover began his killings, I'm going to say that we know of, in the late 1980s, he was a volunteer at the Senior Citizens Society. He was volunteering with elderly people. And it's almost like the reverse paedophile thing. They like to be around children. This guy was putting himself around elderly people, especially elderly women. And with a lot of serial killers, they are also very, very charismatic. And I think that is how they get to lure their victims away and give them a false sense of security that, oh, you know what, I'm actually a nice guy. I want to help carry your groceries. Oh, could I give you a lift somewhere? And then they find out that this helpful person is not quite as helpful as they seem. So he was considered very friendly, very trustworthy. He was married with 2 daughters and lived a contented lifestyle in Mossman. Glover worked as a sales representative for the 4 and 20 Meat Pie Company. And this is important for later. While no proof has been found of Glover killing before 1989, at this stage he had been married for 20 years with children, and his wife had no knowledge of his previous offences. Glover admitted to the killings when confronted with the police evidence. He denied responsibility for other crimes in which he was a prime suspect, including the bashing murder of a 78-year-old artist, Florence Broadhurst, in her Paddington studio in 1977. A number of years after this conviction, Glover admitted that he never worried about who his victims were or why he killed them. He said he wanted to stop killing but could not. After each murder, he apparently went about his normal life. And this isn't unusual amongst serial killers either. You have to think about some of the more well-known killers, such as Ivan Milat, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, even Jeffrey Dahmer. They had lives that they seemingly went about quite normally during, I guess, daylight hours or whatever. But what makes John Glover so unusual is he stalked his victims in broad daylight. Some of the locations that his poor victims were found in were very, very public places. But again, nobody sees anything. Nobody hears anything. And the worst part is with a lot of these murders with the elderly ladies, people thought at first, oh, the poor love, she's had a fall, and the neighbours trying to be helpful, just trying to be good people, not realising they were doing anything wrong, would come out and they would wash the crime scenes down. Because it was like, oh, you know, this poor thing, we can't leave her blood laying there. But they didn't know at the time that these women had actually been murdered. So it was getting very frustrating for the police because we had Good Samaritans coming out, as they do. Let's just clean this up, you know. So that's kind of what had the police scratching their heads for a long time, because the evidence kept getting washed away. So now we get into the actual murder victims of John Wayne Glover. This is where the content becomes very distressing. So if you're possibly triggered by this, or you don't feel it's something you can handle, please feel free to click away now. Totally understand. On the 11th of January 1989, 84-year-old Margaret Todhunter was walking down Hale Road, Mossman, where she was seen by Glover. After parking his car, he walked up to his victim. This isn't even the worst one, but it's really hard to present this, but I'm going to do my best. Let's just do it. He punched Mrs. Todhunter in the face and stole the contents of her purse, including $209. Glover then went to the Mossman Returned Services League, where he spent Mrs. Todhunter's money. Investigating police concluded the crime was a mugging and held little hope of finding the perpetrator. So Mrs. Todhunter actually survived this attack, but this is where he would escalate. On March 1, 1989, as Glover left the Mossman RSL in Military Road, he saw 82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill walking down the street. Glover returned to his car and put a hammer under his belt. He followed Mrs. Mitchell Hill to the entry foyer of her Military Road apartment building. As she went to open the front door, he hit her with the hammer on the back of her head. He then continued to strike Mrs. Mitchell Hill about the head and body. Several of her ribs were broken. Glover fled the scene, taking her purse containing a mere $100. Mrs. Mitchell Hill was still alive when she was found by two schoolboys, but she died shortly after the police and the ambulance arrived. The police had no eyewitnesses nor leads, and nothing concrete linked this attack to the previous attack on Margaret Todhunter that happened just a couple of hours before this. So Mrs. Todhunter was extremely lucky that she survived the attack. No forensic evidence was available either, as well-intentioned neighbours, as I told you before, believing the lady had merely fallen and had washed the crime scene down. Police assumed that it was another mugging gone wrong. Which brings us to his next victim, who I mentioned earlier, Lady Winifreda Isabel Ashton. On the 9th of May 1989, Glover was walking along Military Road when he saw 84-year-old Lady Ashton, the widow of English-Australian Impressionist artist Sir John William Ashton, walking toward him. She was on her way home to nearby Raglan Street. Glover put on a pair of gloves and followed her into the foyer of her apartment, where he attacked her with his hammer. He then threw her to the ground and dragged her. Oh my God, this is so horrible. He dragged her into a rubbish bin alcove, where he repeatedly hit her head on the pavement. Glover recalled that she had almost overpowered him until he fell on top of her and started to hit her head on the pavement. And for anybody, this kind of an attack is so frightening and so horrifying. But for an older lady like Lady Ashton, who's just lived a simple and a good life her whole life, to have her life ended like this, oh, words fail me. And I say that a lot on this channel, but there's something about small children, animals, elderly. They're so vulnerable and they're so unable to fight back. And it's just absolutely disgusting what this man did to these elderly women who had done absolutely nothing to him. And they were people's mothers, they were people's grandmothers, they were people's beloved neighbours and friends. And he just took their lives without even a second thought. After she was knocked unconscious, John Glover removed her pantyhose and strangled her. He then placed Lady Ashton's walking stick and shoes neatly at her feet. He then left with her purse containing, again, a mere $100. Glover then headed for the Mossman RSL, where he commended to staff that he hoped the sirens outside were not another mugging. The audacity of this man. The police found Lady Ashton lying face down diagonally across the concrete floor of the small bin alcove. A pool of blood was around her head. The pantyhose was strung so tightly around her neck that it actually cut through her skin. And on one of the documentaries that I watched on this monster, the pantyhose were cutting into her skin so tightly that when they were removed, there was still pieces of the material embedded in Lady Ashton's skin. And that's just, oh my God, it's absolutely horrible. And of course, as usual, my heart goes out to any remaining family members of these poor ladies that just did not deserve to die like this. They did not deserve their final minutes on earth to be what they were. And I just want to say to the families that my heart goes out to you, and I'm so sorry. Because like I said at the beginning of this video, I could just imagine how I would have felt if someone had done that to my grandmother. I would have been out for blood. So my heart goes out to the families. Her bare legs were crossed and her arms were placed by her sides. She had a thin trickle of blood running out of her mouth. At this point, the police concluded that they were indeed facing a serial killer. To date, all three victims were wealthy elderly women from the same suburb and were all assaulted or killed in the same manner before being robbed of their handbags and money. A post-mortem examination was carried out and no sign of SA was found. The ligature mark around her neck measured 9 centimetres. She had bruises on her nose and temple, on her neck and both her eyelids. At some stage during the struggle, she bit her lips, causing damage to the inner lining of her mouth. A wound was on her cheek, which had an open cut that had a small semicircular abrasion, which was a few centimetres away from it. The examiner noted the victim's diamond ring was still present, suggesting that she had not been killed, in fact, for her money. Oh, this is just getting worse. On the 6th of June 1989, Glover molested a 77-year-old Marjorie Mosley at the Wesley Gardens retirement home in Belrose. The victim reported to hospital staff and police that a man had put his hand under her nightgown, but she said she could not remember what the man looked like. On the 24th of June 1989, Glover had visited the Carolyn Chisholm nursing home in Lane Cove, where he lifted the dress of an elderly patient. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to say this next thing. And touched her in an inappropriate way around her behind area. In a neighbouring room, he slid his hand down the front of another patient's nightdress and inappropriately touched her chest area. The woman cried out for help and Glover was briefly questioned by staff at the hospital before leaving. On the 8th of August 1989, Glover assaulted the elderly Effie Carney in a back street of Lindfield on Sydney's Upper North Shore. On the 6th of October, Glover then pretended to be a doctor and ran his hand up the dress of Phyllis McNeil, a patient at the Wikapedia nursing home in the lower North Shore suburb of Neutral Bay. Glover left when the blind McNeil called for help. At the time, Glover was apparently never suspected of or as being identified as responsible for the molestations. On the 18th of October 1989, Glover followed 86-year-old widow Doris Cox along Spit Road, Mossman, to her retirement village. In the secluded stairwell at the front of the house, he attacked her, ramming her face into a brick wall where she fell, although she survived the assault. But she was unable to provide a clear description or recollection of the events due to the fact that the poor lady was also suffering dementia and couldn't remember what happened. According to her, the attacker was a young man, possibly a teenager, on a skateboard. So Mrs. Cox also tried to assist police with an identikit drawing, but again the scene had been cleaned by neighbours before the investigators arrived. And the other thing that happened with Mrs. Cox was the police went to the hospital to try and question her. She couldn't remember much of what happened, so they showed her face in a mirror that she was all beaten up, and they said, "Listen, darling, somebody has done this to you." And Mrs. Cox just said, "Oh, that's not me." So that was another unfortunate twist in this case, that one of his remaining victims that was actually alive, that got a good look at this guy, couldn't remember. You know, this case would have to be one of the worst I've ever covered. Just the vulnerability of these poor elderly ladies who were just, you know, going about their lives, what they had left of them, not bothering a soul, and this monster just comes out of nowhere. He watched, he waited, and then he pounced. And yeah, this guy just absolutely fills me with loathing and disgust. I think he's one of the worst I've ever presented. So we move on now from Mrs. Cox to his next victims. On the 2nd of November 1989, Glover approached 78-year-old Lane Cove resident Dorothy, I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, Beek, while she was walking home in a quiet back street just off Longville Road, Lane Cove, about 10 kilometres from Mossman. Glover then engaged her in conversation and offered to carry her groceries home for her. Beek invited him inside her house for a cup of tea. Glover declined the tea, but on the return down the laneway to the main street, he passed another old woman and assaulted her from behind. And it's not known why Glover didn't assault the lady that he helped home with the groceries, but she also was extremely lucky. But it was not so for the 85-year-old widow, Margaret Powd, who was also on her way home from grocery shopping. And the police were certain that this was the work of the granny killer. She was hit on the back of the head with a blunt instrument. When she collapsed, he struck her again on the side of her head. Glover again rearranged her clothing, shoes, and walking stick. He took her handbag and left. Again, nobody saw the attack, but within a few minutes her body was found by a young schoolgirl who at first thought the body was a pile of clothing dumped in the laneway, and being young and curious, she decided to investigate. And with what happened before, the neighbours yet again washed down the crime scene as the police and the ambulance are on their way. Glover was also rummaging through the contents of Powd's purse on the grounds of a nearby golf club. He then headed off to the Mossman RSL club yet again to spend $300 he had stolen from Margaret. Within just 24 hours of the Powd murder on the 3rd of November, 81-year-old Olive Cleveland became the 4th woman killed by the now so-called granny killer. Glover struck up a conversation with Cleveland while she was sitting on a bench just outside the Wesley Gardens retirement village, where she lived in the suburb of Belrose. Soon Olive was becoming uncomfortable with the man's attentions, and she got up and proceeded to walk to the main building. Glover then seized her from behind and forced her down a ramp into a secluded side lane, where he hit her repeatedly and pushed her head into the concrete before he removed her pantyhose and tied it tightly around her neck. And once again, Glover rearranged her clothing, shoes, walking stick, and left, taking her money, a very measly $60 from her handbag. He killed this poor lady for $60. Once again, the old woman's injuries were initially attributed to a heavy fall, and yet again, the crime scene was washed down. No eyewitnesses were found. Shortly afterwards, the state government doubled the reward for the capture of the granny killer to $200,000. Glover would not stop there. On the 23rd of November 1989, Glover was sitting in the Buena Vista Hotel in Middlehead Road, Mossman, when he saw 93-year-old widow Muriel Falconer walking opposite the hotel. She also was returning home with her shopping. Glover returned to his car, parked opposite to the police station, as a matter of fact, to retrieve his hammer and his gloves. He followed Falconer to the exterior of her home in Mustard Street. He quietly moved up behind her, while the partially deaf and blind Falconer opened her front door. This guy is completely insidious. I still Even after all the research, all the documentaries I've watched and everything I've read on this guy, it just keeps hitting me. What a effing coward he was. Hitting them from behind. Vulnerable elderly women. Stealing their handbags with, today even, even back then, is not considered a huge amount of money. What an absolute coward. This guy he makes my blood boil. He put his hand around her mouth to silence her before repeatedly hitting her around her head and her neck with his hammer. When she fell to the floor, Glover began to remove Falconer's pantyhose. As he did this, she began to regain consciousness and cried for help. This prompted Glover to hit her multiple times with the hammer, until she finally passed out. He removed her undergarments and used them to strangle her. He searched her purse and the rest of her house for valuables before leaving again with $100. And then he rearranged her shoes. The following afternoon, the body was discovered by a neighbour who entered using a spare key. The crime scene was left undisturbed, and investigators were finally able to collect some forensic evidence, including a very distinctive bloody shoe print. The neighbour described the suspect as middle-aged, portly and grey-haired. The reward was increased to $250,000. And now we are leading into the police investigation and what came next for John Glover. On the 11th of January 1990, Glover visited the Greenwich Hospital in River Road, Greenwich, on his pie sales round. That's why I said the pie van was going to be important for later. He was in his work uniform and carried a clipboard and entered the hospital's palliative care ward, which held 4 elderly and ill women, including 82-year-old advanced cancer patient Daisy Roberts. Glover asked if she was losing any body heat. Oh, he's such a perv. He then pulled up her nightgown and touched her in an indecent manner. Roberts panicked and called for help, upon which a nurse found Glover in the ward. When confronted, Glover ran from the ward and the nurse was able to record his car's registration number and notified the police. And I'm smiling because, yes, this guy is finally going to be caught. The hospital staff were able to identify and name Glover as he was known from doing his pie rounds. A week later, the police returned with a photograph of Glover, which both the nurse and Roberts positively identified. Although this was a significant breakthrough, the hospital assaults were not linked to the murders as yet, nor reported to the murder task force for 3 weeks. Detectives from Chatswood Police Station contacted and confirmed Glover's name via his employers. The detectives contacted Glover and requested he attend an interview at the station the following day. When Glover failed to appear, however, the police rang his home and they were informed by his wife that he had attempted suicide by overdose and was recovering at the Royal North Shore Hospital. That's very telling. Police went to the hospital to see Glover, but he declined to be interviewed, although he did permit them to take a photograph. Staff at the hospital handed police a suicide note that was written by Glover in the middle of the page on the 4 and 20 Pies business paper that contained the words that will become very significant in the case. No more grannies. Grannies and Essie, Glover's mother-in-law, started it. So what he had written on the pie paper was no more grannies. So we're not sure exactly what he meant by that. Did it mean he didn't want to kill any more grannies, or there were no more grannies because he had killed so many? And what he meant by Essie started it was that he blamed his mother-in-law for him committing these murders later in his life. They always have somebody to blame. It's, they always blame it on somebody else. It's something else that triggered them off. It's not them, it's her fault. And we see that a lot with these serial killer cases. There's usually some kind of a catalyst or whatever that tips these guys off. But as was found later, he may have been responsible for even more murders than this. And that's also another running theme in a lot of these cases. We find out years later, after the case is wrapped up, the guys are in prison or they've passed away, that they were actually responsible for even more murders than were first thought. So, 2 weeks later, the suicide note and the photo were passed on to the task force, now numbering some 70 members, whereupon detectives believed immediately that Glover was in fact the granny killer, although they still had no hard evidence. The head of the detective task force said, "If he had said to us, 'I don't want to talk,' we couldn't have proved a thing. Still, the photo matched the descriptions of the grey-haired suspect and his job as a pie salesman. Glover could have been at any of the murder scenes." Glover was interviewed over the nursing home assaults and denied all accusations, as we would expect he would. The police had limited evidence and decided not to question him over the murders, which would have led Glover to know of the police's suspicions. And that's one thing you want to do when you're investigating, is to not let your perpetrator or the person you think you don't want to let them know that you have a pretty good idea that it's them committing the crimes, because they'll go into hiding, disappear, and the killing will continue. So the police had to really handle this smartly and be very, very patient. And they were very patient, and that's just kudos to the task force that was involved with the granny killer case. I honestly don't know how they kept their patience, but they're police, this is what they're trained to do. So we've seen a lot of police corruption in a lot of my cases I present, but when the police actually do their jobs and they do them well, they really do them well, and I have to say that I have to give them props for that. And they did their job as well as they could in this case. It was a very hard case for the police. Glover was put under constant police surveillance, including at one stage with an automatic tracking device. This was to make sure that he was not aware that he was being followed. Glover would drive around the block more than once, and he would also drive the wrong way up one-way streets. And we're not sure if that was an evasion tactic or he just didn't know where he was going, but he may have had some sort of an idea that he might have been being watched. This brings us to John Wayne Glover's final victim. On the 19th of March 1990, Glover killed his sixth and final victim in Mossman. She was 60-year-old divorcee Joan Sinclair from Beauty Point, with whom Glover actually had a friendship with. By this stage, police had Glover under constant surveillance and watched as Sinclair let Glover into her home around 10 a.m. By 1 p.m, no sign of Glover or movement within the house was seen. Police and the surveillance team became concerned around 5 p.m. and got permission to enter the home at 6 p.m. 2 uniformed police knocked on the front door, ostensibly to check on the barking dogs. Because Mrs. Sinclair's dogs had been barking for hours, so they used the excuse of the dogs to come and check to see what was going on. Now, they treated it as a noise complaint so as not to arouse suspicion. Unfortunately, as the police would soon discover, they were too late. There was no answer, and when looking through the rear glass doors, they saw a hammer lying in a pool of dry blood on a mat. 4 detectives searched the house and found Sinclair's battered head wrapped in a bundle of blood-soaked towels. She was naked from the waist down, and her pantyhose were tied around her neck. And this is the most distressing of all of his victims. And this lady was a friend of his. She trusted him. She let him into her home. Her genitals were damaged, but Glover denied assaulting her. After finding Sinclair's body, they then searched the house for Glover, who was found unconscious in a filled bathtub. Glover later told the police he murdered Joan Sinclair and had explained they had been having a relationship for some time. He said that he beat her about the head with his hammer, removed her pantyhose and strangled her with them. Glover rolled the body onto a mat, wrapped 4 towels around her extensive head wounds to stem the flow of her blood. He then dragged her body across the room, leaving a trail behind him. He then ran to the bath, swallowed a handful of Valium with a bottle of VAT 69, slashed his left wrist, and lay in the bathtub to die. So it looks like his final victim was intended to be a murder-suicide. I'm not sure why he thought he had to take this poor woman with him, but that looks like what Glover was planning. and unfortunately for him, he didn't die. At the trial commencing 28th of March 1990, Glover pleaded not guilty to his crimes on the grounds of diminished responsibility. A psychiatrist said Glover had built up hostility and aggression since his childhood against his mother, and then against his mother-in-law, who was said to trigger him. When she died, he had to take out his aggression on someone else. The psychiatrist who studied the case also added that this was a very unusual case because very few serial killers exist, and most of them are mentally ill and have an organic disease of the brain. Glover was sane at the time of the murder. A psychiatrist at the trial, John Shand, said Glover had a severe personality disorder. The Crown prosecutor maintained that Glover was well aware of his actions when he killed. He was also planning what to do with the victim's money, and he had also taken the time to clean his hammer with acid on multiple occasions. Glover was also impotent and had no interest in sex, so tying the pantyhose so tightly around his victim's neck was to make sure that they were dead. It had no sexual component. At the same time, tried to trick the police into thinking that this was the work of a sexually motivated killer. Glover was addicted to poker machines, and the easiest way for him to get more money was to steal. After the guilty verdict was delivered, Justice Wood stated that he was dealing with an extremely dangerous prisoner. He would go on to say, "He is able to choose when to attack and when to stay his hand. He is cunning and able to cover his tracks. It is plain that he has chosen his moments carefully. Although the crimes have been opportunistic, he has not gone in where the risks were overwhelming." So while his crimes were considered opportunistic, there was an element of planning to his crimes that is usually present with all serial killers. They're usually highly organised, and a lot of them do try to make it look like a random crime that is not highly organised. But I also find with a lot of these people, like, serial killers are smart. I mean, don't ever underestimate a serial killer. They are extremely smart people, but they do overlook the obvious a lot of the time. And what Glover overlooked here was that even though he was trying to make these attacks seem random and unplanned, they did begin to form a pattern for the police to follow. So he did have an MO, he was highly organised, and he did fit every profile of a serial killer. The period since January 1989 has been one of intense and serious crime involving violence inflicted on elderly women, accompanied by theft or robbery of their property. On any view, the prisoner has shown himself to be exceedingly dangerous, and that view was mirrored by the opinions of the psychiatrists who gave evidence at the trial. He would go on to say, "I have no alternative other than to impose the maximum available sentence, which means that the prisoner will be required to spend the remainder of his natural life in prison. It is inappropriate to impose any minimum term to be served before release on parole. Having regard to those life sentences, this is not a case where the prisoner may ever be released pursuant to any order of this court." The judge would go on to say, he is never to be released. So, as many of you may know, or if you're not familiar with this case, you may not know, John Wayne Glover would actually go on to successfully end his own life. So, days before Glover ended his own life, he handed his last outside visitor a sketch of a park. Glover pointed out 2 pine trees in the image. In the middle of the right pine tree, the number 9 could be seen between the leaves and branches. The number 9 is said to either represent the total number of murders or the number of unsolved murders committed by Glover. Let that sink in. And the unsolved murders that the police have come to believe may have been committed by Glover include Emmy May Anderson, 78, of East Melbourne, in October of 1961, Irene Kittle, 61, St Kilda, Victoria, the 22nd of March 1963, Prahan, Victoria, 3rd of June 1967, Christina Yanko, 63, Albert Park, 9th of April 1968, Florence Broadhurst, 78, Paddington, New South Wales, the 16th of October 1977, Josephine McDonald, 72, Ettalong, New South Wales, 29th of August 1984, and Wanda Amundsen, 83, Umina, New South Wales, the 21st of November 1986. Glover was imprisoned at Lithgow Prison, where he was held in a maximum security cell. In May of 2005, Glover collapsed in his cell and was placed on suicide watch after telling prison officers, "I've had enough, I want to end my own life." He was examined by a mental health review team and monitored by closed-circuit television. He was also given medical examinations as a follow-up to the 2 cancer surgeries he had undergone the year before. So remember, his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and he actually had the male version of breast cancer, as we covered earlier. On the 10th of September 2005, John Wayne Glover was found dead in his Lithgow maximum security prison cell, and he was pronounced deceased at 1:25 p.m. The 72-year-old serial killer was confirmed to have hanged himself. And that is where we thankfully leave the story of the granny killer, John Wayne Glover. And let me just say this, I'm really glad this guy's dead and he can't hurt anybody else. The police also suspect him of a number of other assaults and murders that he may have committed during his teens and 20s. That is gone further into on Steve LIEBMAN's show, Crime Investigation Australia, No More Grannies, The Granny Killer, that I also used in my research for this program. And you may also want to go and check out Under Investigation with Liz Hayes. She also did a very comprehensive program on John Wayne Glover that brings new things to light. And her show is even better because we have Gary Jubelin, former police detective, was also on Liz Hayes' show. So I'll leave links to those in the description box below, because I don't want to just parrot everything that I've heard from Steve LIEBMAN and from Liz Hayes, because these are renowned, award-winning Australian journalists who put a hell of a lot of work into the cases that they cover. So if you want to know further on this case, please go and check them out. Check out their programs because they are so beautifully done. And particularly Steve LIEBMAN, he just seems to approach these cases with so much heart and so much care. And Liz and Steve have actually been heroes of mine growing up. I was a weird child. I also was, idolised. I idolised newsreaders and journalists my entire life. I was only saying to Mum yesterday when I was 3, I used to love a newsreader and a journalist from back in the 70s named Roger Clemson. And my Nana would be like, "Come, you have to come and have your dinner." I'm like, "Oh, I just want to watch Roger Clemson." And Nan was like, What do you want to watch him for? Oh, he's just a nice man and I like his voice. But yeah, I've always been very in awe of these journalists, and this is kind of my way of fulfilling my dream of being a news presenter journalist. Just didn't have the means to be able to do it when I was younger, so now I'm presenting these cases here on YouTube. But if you want to find out more and watch some truly amazing journalists at work, go and check out their videos, because while distressing, they're amazing. And as I said, that is where we leave this very horrible case today. I'm going to have to go and have a coffee and watch something funny or heartwarming after this, because this just, it makes my blood boil, and then it leaves me as cold as ice to think what this absolute monster did to such a vulnerable part of the Australian community with these elderly ladies. These were ladies who lived good lives. They were much beloved by family and friends, and they did not deserve this. And I'm going to put a little memorial at the end of this video to each of his victims, so that they will never be forgotten and that they will always remain in our hearts and in our prayers, as will their families. So that's it for this case. I hope you guys got something out of it. If you would like to comment anything in the comment section below about this case, please feel free. Also, as I said before, if you would like to include any suggestions of cases you want me to cover in the future, please do so. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to present a case that you'd like to see me present here on the channel. And get ready for the next true crime case, because it's going to be Real Crime Asia Pacifica. And I have got an amazing, it's awful, probably not very well known case, so I'm kind of excited about it, but also with some very, very amazing Australian journalists involved, which is why I'm so excited about it. So the next real crime case you see me present will be Real Crime Asia Pacifica, and that includes all the countries in the Asian Pacific Rim, including us here in Australia and New Zealand and the Philippines. This is going to be a very interesting case for you guys indeed. I'm currently still in the process of researching it because it's a lot, but it's a very different case and I'm really excited about it. So I hope you guys got something out of today. I hope you'll be coming back again. I'm back on my regular schedule of filming and research, and it feels so great to be back. It was nice to have a break. It was refreshing for me. It blew a few of the cobwebs out, and now I'm ready to just get back into investigating and researching and filming for you guys again. So thank you all so much. You have all been so patient with me. I've had a lot of breaks this year, but it'll be regular videos from now on. So thank you so much for your patience. It means an awful lot. Thank you to everybody who regularly comes back. It means the world to me. I love you all very, very much. Until my next video, stay safe, be happy, hug your loved ones close, and I'll see you all very, very soon. Bye. And now in memoriam, all the victims of John Wayne Glover, those who survived, and those who unfortunately did not. Margaret Todd Hunter, Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill, Lady Winfreda Isabel Ashton, Marjorie Mosley, Effie Carney, Phyllis McNeil, Doris Cox, Dorothy Beek, Margaret Pound, Olive Cleveland, Muriel Falconer, Daisy Roberts, Joan Sinclair, Emmy May Anderson, Irene Kiddle, Elsie Boyes, Christina Yankos, Florence Broadhurst, Josephine MacDonald, and Wanda Amundsen. May we forever keep their names and their families in our hearts, minds, and prayers. Rest in peace, ladies.